3 signs that your investment real estate really isn't as passive as you think and what you might be able to do about it. Today on the 1031 Show. I'm Alex Stavorowski, and I've spent hundreds of hours talking with people about their investment real estate. We help people that have used their real estate to achieve financial freedom, but now they're stuck in a vicious cycle and they may not even know it. I'm going to walk you through the top 3 signs that I've gotten from real estate investors that their passive real estate really isn't as passive as they think. Before the 3 signs, let's give a little context on what we mean by passive ownership or a passive investment. The way we see it, real estate isn't a static investment when it comes to the amount of time and energy that has to be put in to maintain it. For a lot of the people that I talk with, it's more of a spectrum of active to passive for ongoing maintenance and requirements and whether or not they're being actively involved in the day-to-day operations of their real estate. And for a lot of people over time, this may change as to the amount of time that they have or want to be able to contribute to that property. A lot of people get into real estate thinking that overall it's a passive investment, only to realize many years later that isn't exactly how it works out. I found this to be especially true of directly owned and managed real estate, regardless of the type of property, the size of the portfolio, and even the amount of time that the properties have been owned. The first sign that your investment real estate really isn't as passive as you think is, can you be reached by your tenants, by your property managers? Are you the direct point of contact for anybody that's in this property or dealing with it? Most of the time when I'm talking with investment real estate owners, this is a constant problem because for them, they want to be able to go and travel or work their other jobs or deal with other things in their life, but they're at the beck and call of whoever is renting that property. Regardless of the reason for the call or communication, most of the time, if you can be reached directly, then that's more involved than you want to be with that property. I've seen this present in multiple different ways, whether it's a lot of calls in the same day from different tenants or the same tenant, texts at any time of day or night, or even people reaching out about problems that you might not be able to handle because you're not in the state, you're not near that property. But the bottom line is that people are reaching out to make their problems your problems. And when you own a property directly, and it's an actively managed piece of your portfolio, then that is your problem. And for a lot of the investment real estate owners that I've talked with, they're after something much more passive, where the problems are being handled without their knowledge, without their communication, without their involvement. For some, the initial approach to solving this problem is creating another barrier between them and their tenants, figuring out how can I have somebody else involved? I like this property, I like the tenant well enough, but I don't want to be the one that they're reaching out to. First step there is property management, finding a company or a person to come in and be that middleman. Now again, we see this more as a band-aid because for most people, property management doesn't quite pan out to the way they think that it should, where their goal is ultimately as passive as possible. Somebody's handling the day-to-day and the big problems, but if the tenant had your number at one point, they'll expect to continue talking to you directly, not going to be overly thrilled with the idea of having to go through somebody else. And now this is something that can be handled as tenants refresh and people move in and out, but ultimately having one other person in the middle may not be enough to get you to that truly passive ownership that a lot of real estate investors are after. Now, if you've listened to this podcast before, you've probably heard me tell the story of my client that was on a 3-week fishing trip. About 5 days into it, he gets a call from the tenant at one of his properties. The toilet in the upstairs bathroom was leaking down through the first floor, had to be fixed immediately. Now, he didn't have the context to have a plumber go over there and get that figured out, and that's not always the case, but for him, he was the handyman, he was the one that had to do it. So he had to cut his trip short, head all the way back home, and get that fixed. Now, for a passive investment, that would have been handled by somebody else. That wasn't something that was going to interrupt his fishing trip and was a big part of the initial conversation we had when he was looking into other options for something to do with his real estate. He didn't know that there were ways that he didn't have to be actively involved and didn't have to be the one getting those phone calls. Didn't even have to own a type of property where that could be a problem. But at the end of the day, that was his current situation, the current pain that he was dealing with, and he needed something else. Unfortunately for some, the solution can also be presenting in the way of trying to keep a good tenant that doesn't contact you that much. You might hear from them once a month or once a year, but it's manageable. but you want to keep that tenant in place. If it's a long-term rental, well, maybe you don't raise the rent this year to next so that they don't go looking out for another opportunity. Over time, this compounds, where rent hasn't been raised and you're not keeping pace with what the market demands because you want to keep this tenant in place. That's all well and good if that's working with the overall portfolio, but that inefficiency as it grows over time is more a result of the active management not being done. So it's not that you have a passive ownership or passive role in your property. So you have an active role and it's just being disregarded. If your tenants or property managers or whoever is involved with your investment real estate is able to contact you directly, and that's a problem that you then have to deal with, your investment real estate is not as passive as you think. The second sign that your investment real estate isn't really as passive as you think is that you're spending any amount of time working directly on that property. A lot of people get their start in real estate with maybe a distressed property or something that they have to go in and fix up themselves. And when they're younger and have the time and energy to do it, that's not a problem. They like working on the property, they like dealing with the renovations and the contractors and everybody involved, but at the end of the day, they know it's a more active involvement that they have. Now this becomes more of a habit than anything and just the status quo of dealing with the property. Well, I own the property, so I need to get in there and deal with the paint and deal with the contractors and get this fixed, or tenant moved out and now we need new carpet, so I'll go in and replace the carpet myself. But that amount of involvement is not a passive investment. That's an actively managed, actively handled problem that most investment real estate owners want to move away from the older they get and the more they're focusing on other ways to spend their time. So take somebody that gets into their first property and sees it as a fix and flip. They're going to do the renovations and fix out all the baseboards and replace the flooring. Fast forward 20 or 30 years, and if you're still painting the baseboards and fixing the outlets, maybe you've hired some contractors or other people to come in for the bigger jobs, but that's your responsibility, and it always has been, and you are under the impression that it always will be. Now, a lot of times, the energy and time that you're spending doing that is spent wishing that you could do other things. You want to travel, you want to enjoy the lifestyle that you've been working so hard for over the last 20 to 30 years. This was actually the case with a couple I talked with just last week. She had come directly to a meeting with me from one of her rental condos. And she had paint on her fingers and paint on her jeans because she was down painting the baseboards in a property that they were trying to rent to another tenant. Now, when we were talking through her properties and the investments that they'd had over time, I started mentioning passive income and ways to generate more passive returns from their investments. She said, well, real estate is a passive investment. What are you talking about? And I asked her, how much time did you spend this morning working at that property? And she looked at me and had this moment of realization that, oh, well, I'm spending a lot of time working pretty hard for this passive income. For somebody that's spent their entire morning working on a specific property to then say, well, isn't my real estate a passive investment already? Obvious answer seems like no, but it's the 20 or 30 years that this has been the routine that people just expect this is what it means to have a passive investment. Well, most of the time it's passive. Most of the time my tenants don't bother me. Most of the time I can do whatever I want until you can't. And it's that until you can't piece that we look at very closely to say, is this actually as passive as we can be? And is it as passive as you would want it to be in regards to the rest of your life? The time and energy that you're putting into this property could be spent elsewhere. For this client in particular, it was her family. She wanted to spend time with the kids and grandkids that live locally, but she just doesn't have the ability to go spend the time with them that she wants because she's dealing with these properties. And now for some people like them, they have enough properties for this to be a constant problem. Something happens over and over and over again. There's a new problem here, something else there, AC goes out here, and they're driving all over town 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, dealing with this passive investment. For a lot of the real estate owners that we talk with, this is not the end-all be-all goal, nor is it the end of the line and only way that they can move forward. Now, it didn't really even take me saying much for her to realize that this passive investment that she thought she had wasn't really as passive as it could be, or she wanted it to be. The conversation quickly led to a couple of my favorite questions, which are, how hard are you working for your passive income, and how hard do you want to be working for your passive income? A lot of people that I talk with don't even have a concept that they could be earning this kind of money that they have with their real estate and have all of the time and energy that is currently being spent to handle the real estate. That opens the door to a lot of possibilities. Well, if I don't have to be dealing with this property to get it fixed up every time a tenant leaves, or go in and do some maintenance, or taking care of toilets and trash and problems and disputes with neighbors, anything and everything that could be a reason that you're spending time on this property, if none of that was part of the equation, what would you rather be doing with your time? Start asking those questions, and people realize that there's a whole lot more to the life that they want than just dealing with this property until they're able to pass it on to their kids. If you're spending any amount of time dealing with your real estate on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, then it is really not as passive as you think. The third sign that your real estate might not really be as passive as you think is that if something happens to you and it all falls apart, that is not a passive investment. When we look at your investment real estate, if we're going to classify it as truly passive, then one of the ultimate tests is whether or not it can pass out of your hands to somebody else's and still be maintained at the same level. For most people, this isn't the case. Whether it's husband and wife or parents to children, not everybody's on the same page with the amount of time and energy that they're willing to put into this investment, even if it is mostly passive. And for a lot of people, say they own a portfolio of single-family rentals or condos or townhomes, residential properties, commercial properties, you name it. If something were to happen to them and somebody else had to step in to fill that role, it wouldn't work. They would either need to fire sale the properties to get out from under the management, or just disregard the management entirely and let the properties fall into disrepair or destroy relationships with tenants. And sometimes that's a worst case scenario and people would try their best. But if at the end of the day your investment real estate is not positioned to transfer seamlessly to somebody else, where they don't have to take over all of the responsibilities that you've come to know and deal with in your time of ownership, then that's not a passive investment. A lot of the real estate investors that I talk with are in that same predicament of, I've got a lot of property, but if I pass this to my spouse, I don't know what's going to happen to it. I need to figure out a way to own or structure this investment and this ownership so that when it does pass, then they're hands off. For most people, that means that they have to then become hands off on their investment real estate themselves for it to transition that way. Because if they're the ones in the properties or dealing directly with the tenants, and somebody else has to take on that responsibility effectively overnight, generally doesn't end well. For an investment class that is so focused on multi-generational wealth, it's often surprising how little planning people put into what happens to their real estate after they're gone. They know from a tax advantage standpoint that they may give a step up in basis, whether a partial to a spouse or a full step up to children, depending on the ownership of the property, but the actual management of it, even though they consider it passive in their lifetime because they've been doing this for 20 years and they know how to deal with this specific tenant, or they know which person to call for a leaky sink or a broken toilet, nobody else does. They've gotten that so wrapped up and in-house with their own management that they consider it passive. But anybody else that would have to take over that ownership would not. And for it to be truly passive, and the way we consider real estate to be, you would need to make sure that the passive nature of it could pass from one generation to the next. One of the first clients I ever helped with their investment real estate portfolio presented this very problem. He was the one that was operating and managing the 6 townhomes that they had, and his wife that was sitting next to him wanted nothing to do with them. She saw that as his project, his responsibility, and he expressed the concern that if he were to die tomorrow and she were to acquire these properties in his name, then she would sell everything as soon as she could for whatever price she could get. That was concerning to him in part because he had hoped this would be a multi-generational part of their portfolio to pass on to the kids and grandkids and help them to achieve financial success as well. But if they ended up selling the properties after he was gone, then that takes a lot of the value, gives it away in taxes, and now these investments that have been held for specific purposes have to find a new home. For a lot of people, it's going to be a better situation to figure that out before they're gone, while you're the one that's still in control of what happens to the real estate. Get it into the hands of professional management or ways that truly offer passive ownership of your investment property so that no matter who takes over the keys, whoever's on title after you're gone, they have to put in as little effort as anybody else would when handling that real estate. If there's concern that if something happens to you, whoever takes over the properties won't be able to fill your shoes, that's a sign that your investment real estate isn't really as passive as you think. And while there's certainly more than 3, the signs we discussed today, the fact that you can be reached directly by your tenants or property management, the fact that you're spending any amount of time dealing with your real estate, or even if something were to happen to you, your real estate portfolio is likely to completely fall apart, are all signs that your investment real estate is really not as passive as you think. If any of these signs resonate with you in terms of the properties that you own and the day-to-day lifestyle that you've been living for far too long, click the link below, schedule some time with me so that we can talk through what it looks like to have truly passive investments in real estate. And in the meantime, if you want to learn more about what I've learned from talking with 1,000 different real estate owners, click this link. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next time on the 1031 Show.